Dragon Age The Veilguard has been mired in controversy for months, and it comes as no surprise that its launch has been embroiled in just that. It is a very divisive game that has been met to a positive critic reception, and with users that remains to be seen. On Metacritic, the game has been hit with a review protest, and Steam has a limited amount of reviews that has gone from 79% positive to now 74% positive, and it is dropping. In terms of sales performance, it looks like it's doing fine. Will this reach the heights of Dragon Age Inquisition's impressive 12 million sales? It seems unlikely right now. Will it meet whatever expectations that Electronic Arts executives have for the game? That remains a mystery, although it is rather notable how quick BioWare was to shut down the idea of DLC, something this company used to be known for with their single-player RPGs. But what has been evident and what I've spoken at length about recently is the divisive nature of this game, an experience right at the center of the culture war, a subject that many game outlets have written off as just an unfounded hate campaign, when in reality there are very real criticisms hitting at the very blatant, careless, real-life political preaching that BioWare wrote for a number of scenes in the game, as noted by Forbes' Eric Kane. Scenes revolving around the companion of Tosh rightfully have been ridiculed, in my opinion, as drivel, not because of the LGBT themes explored, but because it lacks the nuance and competent writing that this studio used to be known for. Some game outlets very loudly expressed happiness and seemingly gave points to the game just for BioWare touching on further progressive representation, and chose not to even dare talk about the quality, or I should say the lack of quality writing, that makes up these scenes. This is a criticism that games media doesn't even wish to discuss, and why I feel in many regards is further evidence of legacy games media failing audiences, or at the very least an example of the lack of institutional ideological diversity within games media, a perspective I've had and complained about for what feels like a decade now. This institutional failure from games media is why it comes as no surprise over the last number of years many gamers have stopped engaging with the Kotaku and IGN articles and instead pivoted to watching creators like myself. This change has caused a lot of industry jobs to be lost, and the blame much of games media loves to throw is at Google and the algorithm. There is no ownership for the toxic, problematic nature of games media and how we got to this point, because of audience losing trust with them. And obviously, I am not solely putting the blame on the slow death of legacy games media on that, but it definitely is a factor that cannot be ignored. So the reason why I bring all of that up is because this recent Aftermath article that we briefly talked about in my last video, and this was titled here, "The Dragon Age Review Controversy Shows How Much YouTube and Twitter Have Poisoned Video Game Discourse." This was written by Nathan Grayson, notorious for his time at Kotaku. The issue I have with this, and I'll say it again, I said this in the last video, it's the phrasing here, and there's been some massive updates I want to get into, but gaming press takes no ownership of their past. They do not at all want to talk about how they failed their audiences in a variety of ways, and the controversial nature of so many releases over the years with baffling takes, baffling review scores. That's how they failed their audiences, and they unfortunately gave rise to a lot of extreme voices, a lot of individuals that have said some crazy things about diversity and all this stuff that I absolutely disagree with. But we need to understand how we got to this point, and you cannot just blame it on algorithms and radicalization of Google, blah 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 blah. That's nonsense. That's drivel in my opinion. And this specifically was a video that John Bain, Total Biscuit, made about 10 or so years ago in regards to games media, and I find it extremely relevant to this discussion and the author of this Aftermath article because he specifically talks about some of Grayson's work.
Nathan Grayson received a lot of flack for his interview with Blizzard regarding Heroes of the Storm, and he focused on female design within so-called MOBA titles.
And yes, some of these individuals, like Grayson, have a history of this for years.
It got a little bit awkward, to say the least, and it received quite a lot of fire as a direct result. This interview in particular, I feel, shows a disconnect between what the general audience of that interview actually wanted and what the interviewer was attempting to derive from it. The interviewer went in there with a particular agenda, and at that point you have to wonder, well, was this work journalistic? Or was this very much editorialized? Is this actually agenda-driven punditry? Is this demagoguery? And you could argue that actually, yes, it is.
10 years later, this video, this perspective from Total Biscuit is still relevant to today, and more specifically, the discussion we're about to have. So I took to my Twitter account responding to this Aftermath article saying true hypocrites Hogwarts Legacy showed that and many other examples. It's why gaming sites are now dying and are not taken seriously at all. It is definitely one of the major factors in my opinion. You shunned very tame, non-progressive voices years ago and deal with the consequences now. You reap what you sow. And this is how Paul Tassi responded. He has a much bigger audience, and it comes as no surprise that he brought up Hogwarts Legacy's review score as evidence that I am completely wrong with this perspective about how the gaming industry has failed its audiences in a variety of ways. Now, if you are unfamiliar with who Paul Tassi is, he's been cited on this channel many times. He does do some great work. A lot of the times I agree with his perspective, sometimes I disagree, and this is an instance that I absolutely disagree and find it a little disgraceful how he's being dishonest about this situation surrounding games journalism and why so many people have turned away against this medium. There isn't obviously one single factor, but I do not think this article is correct in just saying it's YouTube and Twitter. That's the reason why video game discourse is as bad as it is now. And specifically this article coming from Nathan Grayson, if you have not heard, he pretty much says, thanks to algorithmic prioritization on sites like YouTube and Twitter, this is how a growing number of people engage with video games. Plenty of normal people, still manage to tune it out, the hour-long rants and conspiracy theories. But at what point does the rancid flavor of brain rot go from a vocal niche to a borderline mainstream position? And what are the long-term consequences of that? And it goes on to mention, but as these things continue to have relevantly convenient on-ramps like searching Dragon Age on YouTube and getting pulled down the rabbit hole, do we reach a point where there is a predominant mode of conversation around games, inmates taking over the asylum or whatever? Is that where we're headed? Because we've seen this in American politics. The more you enable these people structurally or systematically, the more footing they gain until they become the default. And then they mention Asmongold. This is their example. This is who they're targeting with this specific article and saying that they poisoned all video game discourse. So yes, people like Asmongold are out there making these videos, but like Nathan said, what's a video like that going to top out at? 1 million worldwide among English-speaking people, that's not shit. And then they go on to mention that it's not a given that every 13-year-old boy watching an Asmongold video is going to turn into someone who thinks like that. Most people are relatively normal. I love they keep on bringing up this normal part. And I know we talked about this last video, I just find the phrasing here is very interesting. And there's a point where once people with a certain kind of hateful or twisted or conspiratorial view start to get oxygen, start to get enabled, their views become increasingly bizarre to a normal person. People aren't so easily brainwashed that they'll go along with all of that. I'm more optimistic than other people about all this stuff. Then they talk about that this is a YouTube and a Twitch problem, and then they say this is a radicalization engine for boomers. All these things are radicalization engines. They all ended up at the same place despite starting at different starting points, blah 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 blah. And yes, they very much are targeting Asmongold. He is a massive streamer, and he is, I guess you could say, one of the biggest proponents against anti-woke stuff in the video game industry. I don't agree with a lot of his takes, but he's had some very eye-opening things I think he said about the video game industry that no other individual wants to say because they don't want to get shunned by these gaming companies or these gaming websites and such. But he said he was baffled at instantly getting permabanned from the Dragon Age subreddit, and then they made this gross generalization about his community, saying that due to many repeated infractions of our civility and bigotry rules from users of this community, Asmongold, we have decided automatically to revoke access to our subreddit as a preventive measure so that our community at large can focus on actual criticisms of the game without getting involved in the war against woke culture. Make of that as you will. And yes, some of these accounts that are very much embedded in this culture war nonsense, like Airbagged here, just one of the main individuals, saying LOL that redemption arc lasted long, and the redemption arc was in regards to political takes. It had nothing to do with video games. I think Asmongold made that pretty clear, but Patrician TV, another content creator, rightfully pointed out there is no online redemption arc. There are only vultures who will weaponize your guild. If you do wrong, don't try to appease anyone. Just take a break, and when you come back, make what you want. As we all know, of course, the people of Palestine are deeply invested in the Dragon Age franchise and defending it from online grifters. Clearly, Asmongold is going down the same path when he questions why a bunch of different review sites all use the same exact language. But this will take us back to Paul Tassi's take on Dragon Age The Veilguard and the comparison to Hogwarts Legacy and how gaming's journalism has failed gamers in a variety of ways. And I have many examples of that over the last couple of years of that. Here's a great example from earlier this year. A bunch of talentless freaks, a Concord developer, specifically said that in regards to haters of the game. You know who actually, gave coverage of that? Fandom Wire, a shitty website. Nobody else wanted to touch this. I wonder why. Then we have this. the absolute corrupted nature of review scores, which is why I don't like them. I actually looking into the substance of these reviews, and Screen Rant deducted points because it lacked inclusivity. Black Myth Wukong, that is absolutely insane. And then we have Comic Book Movies, a website I have never heard of. I don't even think that they really cover video games, but Marvel's Black Panther game dev faces backlash after admitting to not hiring white developers. And you would think maybe there's a spin, maybe there's something else here within the story. No, they explicitly said this. We have no white people on our team. I did that because I wanted to create a safe environment. They wanted to foster a safe environment, and they insinuated that white people would contribute to an unsafe environment. And I know the best way for an environment to be safe is to be around people who are just like me, which is that R word, but that R word that nobody wants to mention in this instance. I'm not saying white people are creating unsafe environments. They very much are. I'm saying sometimes it's hard to work with white people because sometimes they think something is okay, but it's really a microaggression. You know who actually covered this story? Nobody from the video game industry, which shows an ideological bias, which has been an argument that I've been making for about a decade now. Then we have the coverage surrounding 6 Days in Fallujah. This was some of the headlines. Houston Press, controversial, I can't even say that, Arab, that type of simulator coming to consoles. And then, as rightfully pointed out, Eric Kane of Forbes, and I'm not saying all games journalism contribute to the chaos that we've seen. There are some amazing articles that come about from Eric Kane, especially Gene Park of the Washington Post. I like a lot of his takes on gaming stuff. Even Paul Tassi, I enjoy a lot of his takes. It isn't just this one thing, but I do think it is a gross generalization to make about YouTubers, especially since there's a lot of content creators doing fantastic work. And then in the games journalism medium, there's a lot of individuals that are also doing a lot of great work, but there's also many individuals that have contributed to this toxic environment, and they very much do need to take some ownership of that, but they do not. They just want to push all of that blame onto YouTube and make a gross generalization about this entire platform. But as Eric Kane said at the time, the attempt to cancel 6 Days in Fallujah is dishonest at best. Then we have kind of funny co-host Colin Moriarty. He was there about 7 or 8 years ago, and he ended up having to be, he was forced out pretty much because of this dumb joke he made at the time. A Day Without Woman, Peace and Quiet, and so many different outlets, so many different gaming websites went after him, and Greg Miller never stood up with him, which I still find absolutely disgusting to this day. But you can compare Colin Moriarty's political takes versus Greg Miller's, and it's not surprising how this didn't pan out. Five Nights at Freddy's creator made political donations to the Republican Party. You know what he also did? Made tons of donations to charities, but none of that was at all mentioned, or nobody cared about that because he donated to a Republican. And that was the main story. That was the cancel campaign that went against him. Far Cry 5 faced tons of criticism because it wasn't about Trump. They wanted it to be, you know, about an indictment on right-wing America. That's what they wanted. Outlets such as The Verge, Polygon ran articles and reviews pretty much disgusted that Ubisoft didn't go all in on this part of America. This was a fun take from earlier this year in which IGN's opinion piece says the Resident Evil game that can't be remade, it's time to rewrite, not remake. This was about Resident Evil 5, and they say now with modern standards, having a white protagonist in a game that's set in Africa is problematic because they're shooting at black zombies, which is just a baffling take in my opinion. Saints Row the remake was an absolute disaster in so many regards, but yet Screen Rant ran this fodder saying Saints Row has issues, but it doesn't deserve the hate. Yes, it does. It was totally disrespectful to the identity of the Saints Row franchise. They tried making it for the modern audience, and it deserved all of the hate and all of the criticism that it received. Just a couple of weeks ago, Space Marine 2's CEO went on an Asmongold video, and he wrote in the comment section that he hoped that this game was a reversion to a time before games were imposing morals on players. He also talked about his time as a CEO at Embracer Group and saying there was tons of games that were extremely preachy, and it absolutely disgusted him, which there's nothing controversial with that. We've seen that over the last couple of years, many games going that route, and it has been met to mockery by a lot of the gaming audience. But we still got this phrasing from games media, controversial remarks. These weren't controversial. They were just speaking to a truth that, unfortunately, a lot of gaming websites, they don't want to talk about. VentureBeat had a preview for Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2019, and they made an argument for it to be censored because it made them uncomfortable. That is blasphemous in my opinion. Pace Magazine, Red Dead Redemption 2's red face proves how far games haven't come. And yes, they're talking about Charles Smith, and yes, they're saying that he did red and blackface. Kotaku, Final Fantasy 16 dev has a terrible answer for why the game is so white. You want to know what the terrible answer is? They tried making an authentic medieval Europe setting with their fictional universe, and that is seen as a big no-no because everything needs to look like Disney and Marvel these days. A CD Projekt Red developer was seemingly fired after outcry from games media, including Polygon, Kotaku, and many other outlets because they made a dumb joke. It was a "did you assume my gender" joke, and yes, many of these opinion pieces came about, which was insane in my opinion. It was a dumb joke at most. That's all it needed to be treated as. But the controversy with Cyberpunk 2077 went much deeper. We had opinion pieces about the preview saying that it had weak gunplay and unimaginative stereotypes, which, you know, it's funny because we then saw a Kotaku writer, John Walker at the time, saying, "I love an argument that says this can't be racist because the imaginary people we made up made the decisions." And yes, he very much was making an argument that the black creator was racist for his gangs being stereotypical of black culture. It made no sense, and rightfully at the time, Mike Pondsmith called him out, saying, "Want to say this just once, I'm really tired of well-meaning people on internet chat boards paternalistically telling me what I as a black person should be offended by." Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, featuring a white male protagonist in the form of Cal Kestis, got this reaction from some in games media, including this Kotaku reporter saying, "I'm gonna say it is as it is, fellas. Having a white male protagonist in 2019 is a political creative decision, especially for a global franchise, but even for a domestic one. Kingdom Come Deliverance's mission was to be as historically accurate as possible, but yet we got these unflattering reviews coming from outlets like Eurogamer, which they said history is a double-edged sword, and they went on to argue that they didn't like the history that was present within this game and tried making an argument against it, which is absolutely insane, subjective nonsense to a subject that is very much objective in my opinion. And we actually even saw another outlet saying the trouble with Daniel Vavra's take on history: can you separate a game about politics and history for someone who supports GG? And Vavra hit back, fortunately, saying, "Years ago I retweeted survey link to let people outside of its author's social bubble express their minds. According to the author, it was harassment. Now she wrote fact-free hippies trying to smear me and harm ourselves. That's journalism, thanks." And that is the absolute insanity of this games industry the last number of years. You want to argue these are just a few bad takes? Sure, you can try that, but these are just a few notable examples that I'm bringing up of an industry that has an ideological bias. They'll attack and smear a game developer for lukewarm conservative views and just not decide to cover an EA developer, saying they purposefully chose not to hire white people because they make them feel unsafe. That is what I'm arguing is a problem. If you want to just blame people like Asmongold for white discourse is a mess, maybe look in the mirror. Look at the failure of games journalism, all these bad takes, quote unquote, as an example of why trust in this medium has slowly disintegrated over time. Understand how we got to this point, because it sure as hell isn't a single factor like platforms and algorithms. So this brings us back to what Paul Tassi tweeted out, in which he pretty much tried making the argument that gaming press has been fair to all of these games, including Hogwarts Legacy. That is seemingly the argument that he's making here, and that wasn't the point at all that I was bringing up. But if we are going to talk about Hogwarts Legacy, it is important to remember how controversial that game was and how the game and the developers were mistreated by much of gaming's press. Paul Tassi can try to act like this wasn't what was happening and call it a generalization, but much of gaming press engaged in a cancel campaign against that game, and you cannot rewrite history. And I brought this up in my original reaction. I said, straight up gaslighting, you can twist this into some likes here, but you aren't at all addressing what the tweet was about. Many of your colleagues pushed out tame voices and now deal with the extreme. Many outlets boycotted and advocated against Hogwarts, and I brought that up in a number of tweets here. And Paul Tassi responded saying, "Yeah, and you are treating them like a monolith when look at review scores." That's the problem. Review scores don't tell the whole story, and I fucking hate how this industry just looks at review scores and say there's evidence that a game's good or bad. There is substance that you're actually supposed to look into these reviews, and many of them had problematic areas in which they bring up stuff that has nothing to do with Hogwarts Legacy, like J.K. Rowling's politics or the supposed anti-Semitic nature of goblins. These were things that were non-issues, but for some reason a lot of these reviews, a lot of these outlets brought this up. And then there was the fact that all of these outlets were, you know, hammering home on all the negativity that they could surrounding the game because they wanted it to fail. They wanted the boycott to succeed, but that did not happen because turns out a lot of people don't care about this perspective from games media. And I responded saying, "My guy, look at the original tweet you responded to. This was only about how Grayson's claims games discourse was poisoned by YouTube and Twitter, which I never said shit about scores. You did. There was tons of outrage about Hogwarts and many positive reviews speaking to Rowling." And then Paul said, "You can keep bringing up Rowling. I only brought it up once in this conversation. You can look at it again. This man's just trying to lie about this conversation." And he says, "You can keep bringing up Rowling like there isn't some insane meltdown every time a game has anything remotely woke in it now. It's literally weekly." And that is not at all the discussion I am having here. I'm saying the reason why we even got to this point is because of games media, or at least is one of the major factors. And I said, "You keep bringing up Rowling. There's one mention of it in one tweet, and yeah, you are right. What is this argument? That's not something I'm even arguing about." lot. I said it before, but you're ignoring that these extreme voices are here due to the past actions of Game Press. And then Paul responded for the final time saying, what are these actions of the Game Press? And please answer without screenshotting 5 headlines in 10 years you don't like. And if you look through this thread, he is just straight up lying and being dishonest, because these specific articles came in just the last few years, and it was in the lead up to Hogwarts Legacy. And that's what a lot of games meet, a lot of these individuals do. And I like Paul Tassi. I think that a lot of his coverage, especially in regards to Bungie Destiny, I like reading about it and some of his takes. But some of this behavior is honestly unacceptable in my opinion, but he gets away with it because his audience, they just absolutely feed into it no matter what, and they agree nonstop. And many of the individuals responding to my tweets were saying that there was no hate campaign or anything against Hogwarts Legacy, which is a straight up lie. And even if he wasn't making that argument, seemingly his audience was pretty much trying to make it for him. And I responded saying, all those headlines are in the lead up to Hogwarts. I genuinely don't get why you keep, I should have just said he was being dishonest, because that's what he actually was, not gaslighting. If only you could stop with the disingenuous remarks before getting to response. And I said, shunning tame voices because of wrongthink, attacking games/creators for non-progressive views, and yeah, I can give you another number of examples, many of which I talked about earlier on in this video. But if we're going to try rewriting history and lying about what happened with Hogwarts Legacy, I'm going to deconstruct that perspective right now, because it's total bullshit that Paul Tassi is trying to spew. And this is actually coming from one of his colleagues at Forbes, the smear campaign against Hogwarts Legacy developer Troy Levitt, and which, yeah, Troy Levitt, one of those developers who is a senior developer on Hogwarts Legacy, and tons of games media went after him, lying about his position on the team, calling him a lead developer, calling him alt-right, and at worst he had lukewarm conservative views. That was it. But they tried making him out to be an alt-right figure. The reason why is because they wanted to paint this game negatively, and as you can see on the screen, these are all the different articles that they smeared him, they lied about that man, and they ended up getting the guy to actually quit from his position because he didn't want to hurt his team. What they did to Troy Levitt was absolutely disgusting, and a lot of that blame is on games media and how they handled that coverage. And as Eric Kane called it, it was a smear campaign. And then towards the launch of Hogwarts Legacy, Eric Kane again on his Substack said, games media versus Hogwarts Legacy. You're not actually holier or better than everyone else because you hate JK. Sometimes a game is just a game. In the latest episode of his podcast, I talked about the controversy surrounding Hogwarts Legacy's video game and the boycotts of said game by Hogwarts Harry Potter author. I also pay a visit to my favorite gaming website, thegamer.com, because I love the smell of hypocrisy in the morning almost as much as napalm. And then in subsequent videos, he talked about Wired's Hogwarts Legacy review is a disgrace. He also talked about in a separate video, Let's Rant about the Hogwarts Legacy boycott and games journalists. This is coming from one of his colleagues at Forbes, so I find this, you know, his rewriting of history, acting like Hogwarts Legacy wasn't this massive controversy in regards to how games media was handling it, absolutely blasphemous. And then we have this article coming from Axios, which was written right around the time Hogwarts Legacy released, in which they acknowledge how this game has been handled much differently than many other releases. They say in a deviation from standard pre-release coverage, many outlets are putting caveats in their Hogwarts Legacy reviews. You don't think that's, you know, a massive story in of itself to Paul Tassi of Forbes? No? While others are sidestepping the game entirely, access to the game so far is controlled by WB, which likely, like any other publisher, chooses which outlets to send review codes to. IGN, the most popular video game site in North America, ran a rave, but included a sidebar labeled concerning J.K. Rowling. That's absolutely insane that they had to put a statement in the review about her that states inconclusively, as critics, our jobs is to answer the questions of whether or not we find Hogwarts Legacy to be fun to play and why. Whether it's ethical to play is a separate but still very important question, and they were absolutely bashed for that by so many different games, websites, and journalists. A British gaming outlet Rock Paper Shotgun is counter-programming with a series of outlets about Magic-based games, with a special emphasis on Magic games made by trans developers. A Canadian outlet, The Gamer, is among those that won't review Hogwarts Legacy. The publication also won't create online guides for the game, but they went non-stop with negative headlines for it. And I do want to specifically get into that, but again, this was one of the main reviews for Hogwarts Legacy that earned a 1 out of 10. There is no magic in Hogwarts Legacy. They gave it a 1 out of 10 because they didn't like J.K. Rowling. That's what this review is all about. It's nothing to do with the game. It's just about Rowling's politics. And then we have Kotaku, in which they said 15 hours with Hogwarts, magical surface, rotten core, and you know exactly what they mean by rotten core. And then we had many individuals and even some journalists endorsing going after streamers for playing Hogwarts Legacy, in which there was a website set up said, have they streamed that wizard game? This was a harassment campaign, and you cannot lie about the past and how all of this played out, because it was a disgusting ordeal by many individuals on social media, along with games media. And this is the gamer. This is specifically what they did. Hogwarts Legacy made us ignore that type of phobia, so what's next, which is that's an insane characterization of the situation. They also laughed at people being bullied for playing Hogwarts Legacy, pretty much saying it was a non-story and people need to get over it, which again, insane of itself. And then I'm not lying about them, you know, all of their stories, everything that they did in the lead up or after Hogwarts Legacy, it was just non-stop negativity, because that was the only phrasing that they wanted to do with this game, because they wanted it to fail, and that did not happen. And yeah, like I said, it's non-stop here. Games media has failed the Hogwarts Legacy test. Hogwarts Legacy trans character comes under fire for awful name. Hogwarts Legacy Discord moderator tells users to stop talking about those rights. Ad protests are fruitless without the biggest stars, and it goes on and on and on. They even talked about the inclusive character creator, saying it's a sad sign of hypocrisy. It was a great character creator, but they can't acknowledge that because that doesn't feed into their narrative. IGN, this is what I'm talking about with their review. They had to have a huge segment about J.K. Rowling, which is insane, and many other outlets did the same thing. And let's not forget that the IGN reviewer in question admitted on a podcast that nobody within the company wanted to touch the game. We even had Games Hub saying Hogwarts Legacy does not deserve to be reviewed on its own merits. Just an absolutely insane admission there. Refinery 29, no, you can't separate Hogwarts Legacy from Rowling's that. We have Pink News saying Hogwarts Legacy release prompts more anti-Semitism. Those were stupid and they never made any sense, but all these websites kept running with it for a reason. GameSpot ran with an article talking about Rowling's views. Polygon ran an article about Hogwarts Legacy, the history of it, and how it was so problematic. We had the New York Times even writing an article saying Hogwarts Legacy can decide debate over Rowling. Fortune magazine saying Harry Potter game branded that type of simulator. Nobody said that, but these outlets had to run with this narrative. Attracts record interest after boycott backfires. Inverse saying the real world cost of Hogwarts Legacy is unforgivable. And yes, many of these outlets ran with narratives that people would actually die if people played a video game from the Harry Potter IP, which was just insane to me at the time, and it's still insane to me now. We had many other journalists, Nathan Grayson, saying it doesn't get much more on the nose than this, and this was in reference to a Kotaku article about Troy Levitt, calling him a lead designer. He was not. He was a senior dev. He used to run anti-social justice YouTube channel, and yes, the defamation from many outlets called him alt-right, and much, much worse. And many individuals went after Levitt and his role within the company, including individuals like Grayson here, saying at the very least his functions at a look at the inner machinations of big companies when it comes to far-right extremism. GG, they try to feign ignorance when they really step into it, but the truth is that they know, they just don't care. Which this was yet another example on the attack on the game and Levitt, which in my opinion was an absolutely a smear campaign against him. Patrick Klepek went after Hogwarts Legacy and the many outlets covering it, saying watching gaming outlets jump through rhetorical hoops to justify coverage on the game isn't surprising, but it'd be more honest if they'd play it straight. Just said our shaky business model does not allow us to ignore any game that might sell 10 million copies. We had another gaming outlet, Game Cult, saying that they would not review the game because of everything involving J.K. Rowling, saying we refuse to give an echo to a brand whose economic and media weights benefit a woman erected as the figurehead of a movement of hatred, a woman whose activism aims to roll back the rights of trans people who are already constantly dehumanized. We had an IGN writer saying it's too bad that they couldn't have just made a cool open world Magic School game without using a license created by that type of phobe. Like, you can make your own fantasy Magic worlds. I promise no one has a monopoly on that idea. A Kotaku writer saying I absolutely agree that people in the position to make decisions about this should consider buying into the promotional cycle of this game. I know that the economics of this is complicated, but it's pertinent to at least be judicious how we talked about it. The editor-in-chief of Fanbyte Media saying that they decided they didn't want to engage in the marketing of Hogwarts Legacy and they refused to cover it at all. A Kotaku writer saying I'm excited to also find out the review editors at which publishers were willing to take the Faustian bargain instead of doing right by their readers, which this is a perspective that maybe should have been given to Dragon Age The Veilguard, but I guess that's the conversation we can't have because the politics don't align. A VG247 GameSpot writer saying every single critic that couldn't even write a paragraph on dealing with the bigots' disgusting views on that type of community have failed at what they're supposed to do on an intrinsic level and should quit writing. A former Rock Paper Shotgun writer saying everyone willingly playing Hogwarts is a stinky little centrist coward, especially you if you're reading this, who are ostensibly friends or at least professional acquaintances. You're playing the turf game where you do anti-Semitism, then go suck off a wand, loser. We even saw a video game developer, no outlet ran with this story at all, the fact that she was fired from her position because she was looking forward to playing a Harry Potter video game. A gaming outlet, The Loadout, ran with this review, Hogwarts Legacy review, often magical, usually troubling, and you know exactly what that troubling part, what they're referring to there, and they gave the game a 7 out of 10. Even PC Gamer, in a pretty decently reviewed score, gave it an 83, but they couldn't stop talking about J.K. Rowling, saying the best game in Harry Potter history, but a hard one to be excited about. GamePer, Hogwarts Legacy is a good game trapped in a cursed IP. They gave the game, I believe, a 7.5 out of 10, and they specifically said the Harry Potter property and everything around it remains the main problem. And GameRant, Hogwarts Legacy should have done more to support trans players. And this ultimately goes back to my perspective about that review score and how it does not at all fucking matter to how games media covered that, and I absolutely find it insane how we're rewriting history and acting like games media didn't fail audiences with how they covered that game. It was absolutely disgusting, and the way that Paul Tassi is lying about this history is something that I will not allow to happen, and yes, I will deconstruct it like I did throughout this video, and I will do it in the future if you want to keep on lying about how games media continues to fail their audience and the reason why so many individuals are looking to the Scalps and Mr. Matty Plays, and yes, Asmongold, for their coverage on a game rather than them.